Chapter 10 Gaithersburg, Maryland. It was a one-story ranch-style house, generic-looking, distinguished from its neighbors only by the well-pruned holly bushes that grew around its foundations, a moat of spiny-leaf greenery even in winter. It seemed an unlikely place of safety, and maybe it was one, but Ambler had to find out. He rang the doorbell and waited. Would she even be home? He heard footsteps, and another question formed in his mind. Would she be alone? There was just one car in the garage, an old Corolla, and none in the driveway. He had heard no noises of cohabitation, but that was not proof. The front door was opened a few inches, a chain stretched across the opening. A pair of eyes met his and widened. "Please don't hurt me," Laura Holland said in a quiet, frightened voice. "Please, just go away." And the nurse who had helped free Ambler from Parrish Island shut the door on him. He was prepared to hear her footsteps rush away, a phone being dialed. The door was cheap, brown painted fiberboard with glued-on detailing. The chain was a joke. One shove and it would have broken off the latch. Yet that was not an option. Ambler had only one chance. He had to play it right. She had stepped away from the door, but, he could tell, was still standing near it, as if frozen by uncertainty, indecision. He rang the bell again. "Laura," he said. There was quiet in the house. She was listening. The words he spoke next would be critical. "Laura, I will go if you want me to. I'll go and you'll never see me again. I promise you that. You saved my life, Laura. You saw something nobody else saw. You had the courage to listen to me, to risk your career, to do what no one else did, and I'll never forget it." He paused briefly. "But I need you, Laura. I need your help again." He waited several long moments. "Please forgive me, Laura. I won't bother you anymore." He turned away from the door, his heart sinking, and walked down the two-step porch, scanning the street. It seemed impossible that he could have been followed, and surely there was no reason for people to think he would be paying a call on anyone from the Parrish Island rotation. But he would reassure himself yet again. He had made the trip down from New York using a cab and 2 rented cars, and throughout his journey he had monitored the traffic for any sign of a tail. He had carefully scouted out the entire subdivision where she lived before making his approach, and there was nothing awry. At mid-afternoon, the street was nearly deserted. A few cars of people who, like Laura Holland, worked an early shift and were home, awaiting the return of their children from school. Game shows spilled from the windows of some of the ranches. Elsewhere, soft rock radio stations played as housewives, a hardy species despite bulletins warning of their endangered status, did ironing or sprayed polish on department store furniture. He heard the door opening behind him before he reached the drive, and he turned around. Laura Holland was shaking her head in self-reproach. "Come inside quickly," she said, "before I come to my senses." Wordlessly, Ambler entered the modest house and looked around. Lace curtains, a cheap imported rug on the mass-produced oak flooring, a generic sofa but covered with an interesting oriental-looking piece of embroidered fabric. The kitchen had not been changed since the house was built. The counters were linoleum, the appliances harvest gold. The floor was a kind of harlequin pattern vinyl that was cut from a roll. Laura Holland looked scared, angry at him, but angrier at herself. She also looked beautiful. In Parrish Island, she had been the brusque, pretty nurse. At home, with her hair down, dressed in a sweater top and jeans, she was more than just pretty, he could see. She was lovely, even elegant, her strong features softened by her wavy auburn hair. She moved with natural grace. Under her loose-fitting sweater top, she was hard and soft, supple and yielding. Her waist was narrow, and yet there was something almost maternal to the swell of her breasts. Ambler realized she was staring, and he averted his eyes. With a pang, he saw the small revolver, a Smith & Wesson .22, mounted on a bracket near the spice rack. Its presence was significant. More significant was the fact that Laura Holland had made no move toward it. "Why are you here?" she demanded, looking at him with wounded eyes. "Do you realize what can happen to me?" Laurel, if you're grateful, get out. Leave me alone. Ambler flinched as if he'd been slapped and bowed his head. I'll go, he said in a voice like a whisper. No, she said, I don't know what I want. There was anguish in her voice, embarrassment, too, that he was witness to it. I brought you trouble, didn't I, because of what you did? I want to say thank you, and I want to say I'm sorry. Absently, she ran an anxious hand through her lustrous hair. The key card? It wasn't actually mine. The night shift nurse always leaves hers in the dispensary drawer. So they figured I'd palmed it from her somehow. You got it. The video made it pretty obvious what happened, or so they thought. Everyone got a reprimand, and that was the end of it, aside from the 2 guys on medical. So, you left, and now you're back. Not back, Ambler corrected. They told us you were a dangerous man, psychotic. Ambler's eyes flickered toward the wall-mounted revolver. Why hadn't she grabbed it, armed herself? Somehow he doubted that she was the one who put it there. Someone must have mounted the gun for her, a husband, a boyfriend. It wasn't a man's gun, but it was the gun a man would have obtained for a girl. A certain kind of man, anyway. They told you those things, and you didn't believe them, Ambler said. Otherwise, you wouldn't have let the dangerous psycho in your house, especially since you live alone. Don't be so sure, she said. You didn't used to, Ambler said. Tell me about your ex. You seem to know so much. Why don't you? He is, or was, a double X. Ex-U, ex-military. She nodded, looking slightly startled. A veteran, in fact. She nodded again, the color beginning to drain from her face. Maybe a little paranoid, Ambler said, tilting his head toward the gun bracket. So let's think this through. You're a psychiatric nurse in a secure facility belonging to the Walter Reed complex. Now, why would that be? Maybe because your man came back home from a tour of duty. From Somalia, Desert Storm, a little messed up in the head. Post-traumatic stress disorder, she said quietly. And so you tried to heal him, make him whole. Tried, she said. There was a tremor in her voice. And failed, Ambler said, but not for lack of effort. So you go to school, maybe at one of the military professional schools, and they encourage you to specialize, and you throw yourself into the subject, and you're smart, so you do well. A psychiatric nurse, military background, Walter Reed, Parrish Island. You're good, she snapped, resentful of being reduced to a case study. You're good. That's what got you in trouble. Like they say, no good deed goes unpunished. Is that why you're here? She said, stiffening. To see that punishment is served? Christ, no. Then why the hell? Because... Thoughts swirled in Ambler's head. Maybe because I'm worried that I am mad, and because you're the one person I know who looks at me as if I'm not. Laura shook her head slowly, but he could tell that the fear was ebbing from her. You want me to say you're not psychotic? I don't think you're psychotic, but what I think doesn't mean diddly. To me, it does. Want some coffee? If you're making it, said Ambler. Instant okay? You don't have anything faster? She gave him a long, level look. Once again, it was as if she were looking through him to some core selfhood, some essential sanity. They sat together drinking coffee, and suddenly he knew exactly why he had come. There was a warmth and a humanity to her that he desperately craved right now, the way he craved oxygen. Osiris's discussion of mnemonic overlay, of the armamentarium of mind control techniques, had been profoundly harrowing. It was as if the ground beneath his feet had vanished. The spectacle of the man's violent death, harrowing too, only added to the authority of his voice. Where others, it seemed, sought him as an operative for hire, Laura Holland was the one person in the world he could find who, for whatever reason, believed in him as he wanted to believe in himself. The irony was painful. A psychiatric nurse who had seen him at his very nadir, was the sole witness to his sanity. "I see you," she said slowly, "and it's like I see myself. I know we're as different as can be." She closed her eyes for a moment. "But there's something we've got in common. I don't know what." "You're my port in a storm." "Sometimes I think ports welcome storms," said the nurse. "A virtue of necessity?" "Something like that," she said. "Speaking of which, it was Desert Storm. Your ex-husband, ex-Marine. It's kind of an identity in itself, being ex-Marine. It never really leaves you, any more than what happened to him in Desert Storm ever really left him. So what does it all mean? Am I just attracted to trouble?" "He wasn't post-traumatic when you met, was he?" "No, not then. That was a long time ago. But he got shipped out, did 2 back-to-back tours, and came back different. And not in a good way. Started to drink, a lot. Started to hit me, a little. A little is too much. I kept trying to reach him, like there was a broken little boy inside him. I could somehow make him all better, if only I could love him enough. I did love him, and he loved me too. He wanted to protect me was the thing. He got paranoid, started to imagine enemies everywhere. But he was afraid for me, not just for him. Only thing that never occurred to him was that for me, he was what there was to be afraid of. That gun on the wall, he put it there for me, insisted I learn how to use it. Most of the time I forget it's there, but sometimes I thought about using it to protect myself against him." She closed her eyes, nodded, embarrassed. She was silent for a while. "I should be terrified of you. I don't know why I'm not. It almost scares me that I'm not scared of you. You're like me. You go by your instincts." She gestured around her, and see where it's got me. "You're a good person," Ambler spoke simply. Without thinking about it, he reached over and placed a hand on hers. "That what your instincts say?" "Yeah." The woman with the green-flecked hazel eyes just shook her head. "So tell me, is there a shell-shocked vet in your background?" "My lifestyle wasn't conducive to deep relationships, or shallow relationships for that matter. Hard to keep a lover if you're going to be disappearing for 7 months in Sri Lanka, or Madagascar, or Chechnya, or Bosnia. Hard to have civilian friends when you know you're dooming them to an intensive period of surveillance. Just protocol, but when you're in a special access program, a civilian contact is either somebody you're using, or, the fear is, somebody who's using you. It's a good life for a loner. A good life if you don't mind relationships that come stamped with an expiration date, like a quart of milk. It was a sacrifice, a big one, but it was supposed to make you less vulnerable." "And did it?" "I've come to think it had the opposite effect." "I don't know," Laurel said, the recessed overhead lights burnishing her wavy hair. "With my luck, I would have been better off if I'd always been alone." Ambler shrugged. "I know what it's like to have people change on you. I had a dad who drank. He was really good at holding it, and then he wasn't. An angry drunk. At the end of the day, most of them are." "He beat you?" "Not much," Ambler said. "Not much is too much." Ambler looked off. "I get good at reading his mood. With drunks it's tricky, 'cause they can turn on a dime. Giddy, laughing, then suddenly smack, with an open hand or a closed fist, depending, and the expression on his face blackens into a "kid, you got a smart mouth on you" scowl. Christ. He was always sorry afterward, really, really sorry. You know what it's like. The guy says he's going to change this time, and you believe him, because you want to. She nodded. You have to believe him. Like you believe that someday the rain's got to stop. So much for instincts. I'd call it self-deception. Ignoring your instincts. See, if you're that little boy, you get real good at watching your old man's face. You learn to recognize when he seems to be in a bad mood, but it's only because he's down on himself. You ask him then if you can have your allowance, if he can buy you a new action figure, and he looks at you like you did him a favor, hands you a $5, maybe a 10, and says, "Make yourself happy." Says you're a good kid. Other times he seems giddy, happy, and you look at him cross-eyed and suddenly it's a cloudburst and he's going to belt you for sure. So you never knew how it was going to play out. He was totally unpredictable. No, that's the thing, Ambler said. I learned to tell the difference, learn the subtleties, learn to tell apart the weather systems. By the time I turned 6, I knew his moods like I knew the alphabet. Knew when to get the hell out of his sight, knew when he was in a generous mood, knew when he was angry and aggressive, knew when he was passive and self-pitying, knew when he was lying to me or to my mom. A heavy thing for a kid. He left by my 7th birthday. Were you and your mom relieved? It was more complicated than that. He stopped. Laura was quiet for a while as they sipped bad coffee. You ever had another job, other than being a spook, I mean? A couple of summer jobs, serving at barbecue at a fairground place outside of town. You hope people would eat their spare ribs after they went on the roller coaster. I used to be pretty good at drawing. I did a junior year abroad in Paris. Tried to make money as a street artist. You know, you'd sketch portraits of passersby, try to get a few francs from them. Your road to riches, huh? I had to take the first exit. People got incredibly upset when they saw what I drew. Bad at resemblances? It wasn't that. He broke off. God, I haven't thought about this for years. It took me a while to realize what the problem was. Basically, the way I saw these people wasn't necessarily the way they wanted to be seen. Somehow on my sketch pad, people ended up looking scared, or eaten by self-doubt, or despairing, and maybe it was the truth. But it wasn't a truth they wanted to see. A lot of the time it freaked them out or pissed them off. I'd hand them the sketch and they'd go crazy, crumple it up, and rip it into pieces before putting it in the trash. It was almost a superstitious thing, like they didn't want anyone else to see it, to glimpse their soul. At the time, as I say, I didn't fully understand what was happening. Do you understand what's happening now? He stared at her. You ever get the sense you don't really know who you are? Try all the time, she replied, her lynx eyes drawing him in. What did they do to you? He responded with a miserable half smile. You don't want to know. What did they do to you? She repeated. Now she put a hand on his, and the warmth from the contact seemed to travel up his arm. Slowly he began to tell her about his disappearance from the databases and electronic archives, and then, in broad strokes, the essentials of what Osiris had told him. She listened contemplatively, and her calm was contagious. Finally, she said, You want to know what I think? He nodded. I think they tried to mess with your mind when you were on the inside. In fact, I'm sure of it. With drugs and electroshock and Lord only knows what else. But I don't believe you can ever really change who a person is. Quietly, he said, when I was inside, I heard a recording of myself. He described it bloodlessly. How do you know it was really you? I just know, he said, flailing. Laurel's focus was razor sharp. That can all be explained. Explained? How? I did a unit on pharmacology in nursing school, Laurel said. Let me get my textbook and I'll show you. When she returned a few minutes later, she was carrying a thick textbook with a maroon and gold embossed cover. The sort of psychosis you were talking about, it could be drug-induced. She turned the pages to a chapter on anticholinergic drugs. Look here, in the discussion of overdose symptoms, it says anticholinergics can result in psychosis. But I don't remember any of it. I don't remember the psychosis, don't remember getting doped up. They could have combined the anticholinergic with another drug like Versed. She flipped through the onion skin pages. Look here. She tapped a bulleted passage with a finger. Drugs like Versed interfere with memory formation. There's a whole warning about anterograde amnesia, meaning amnesia of events following the injection. What I'm saying is, with the right drug cocktail, you could have been plunged into an episode of madness, but you'd have no memory of it. You'd be a raving lunatic for a few hours. Ambler nodded slowly. The hairs on the back of his neck were prickling with excitement. And then they record you while you're in this state, she went on, and make believe that you're crazy. Try to persuade you that you're crazy for whatever reasons of their own. Reasons of their own. The larger questions, who, why, yawn like an abyss that would repay those who gaze too deeply into it with destruction. Grappling with the elementary question of what was exhausting enough. Reasons of their own. To ascribe reason to madness was only a seeming paradox. The artificial induction of dementia was, in fact, in the counter-espionage arsenal of dirty tricks, a method of discrediting someone. A tape could be quietly circulated, which would persuade any interested parties that the subject was indeed stark raving mad. Inquiries would be swiftly put to rest. The prospect was horrifying. Then why did Hal Ambler feel oddly exhilarated? Because he was not alone, because he was putting the pieces together with somebody else, somebody who believed him, who believed in him, and whose belief helped him to regain his own belief in himself. He might still have been lost in a labyrinth, but Theseus had found his Ariadne. How do you explain about the databases? Ambler pressed. It's as if I never lived. You know about the things that powerful people can do, so do I. I hear gossip at work, the stuff people aren't supposed to talk about, but do anyway. About creating records for people who never existed. Not that much harder to erase the records of someone who actually did exist. You know how crazy that sounds? Less crazy than the alternative, Laurel said firmly. There was certainty in her voice, a certainty that dismissed Osiris's hypothesis out of hand. They're burying you in the psych system, so they want to put off any casual inquiries, kind of like kicking away the ladder after you've climbed through the window. What about what I saw in the Sourlands? There was no sign of my cabin, no sign that it ever really existed. And you think that's beyond the landscaping skills of somebody able to enlist a powerful government agency? Laurel, listen to me, he said, his voice almost breaking. I look in the mirror and I don't recognize myself. She reached over and touched his cheek. Then they changed you. How is that possible? I'm not a surgeon, she said, but I've heard rumors about plastic surgery techniques, about how they can change people so the person himself couldn't even tell he'd ever been operated on. I know that you can keep people anesthetized for weeks at a time. They do it in burn wards sometimes to spare patients from a period of agony. There are all sorts of minimally invasive surgery they do now. They could have changed your face, then kept you under until you'd healed up. Even if you had conscious intervals, Versed therapy, again, could stop memories from forming. How would you ever know? That's crazy, Ambler repeated. She came over to him, stood very close, and placed her hands on his face. She examined the skin along his jaw, his ears, and then felt for scars that might be concealed behind his hairline. She peered closely at his eyelids, cheeks, nose. He could feel the warmth of her own face near his, and then, as she ran her fingertips over his features, something stirred within him. God, she was beautiful. See anything? The operative asked. Laura shook her head. Haven't found any entry scars, but that doesn't mean anything, she insisted. There are techniques I wouldn't even know about. The scalpel could enter through the mucosa of the nose, the reverse of the eyelids, all sorts of possible surgical portals. It isn't my field. You don't have any evidence for this, you just think it. Although the words were of skepticism, Ambler was momentarily buoyed by her stalwart conviction. It's the only thing that makes sense, she said heatedly. It's the only thing that makes sense of what you'd experienced. That's assuming, of course, that my experience, my memory, makes sense. He fell silent. Christ, I feel like such a goddamn victim. Maybe that's how they want you to feel. Look, the people who did this to you, they're not good people. They're manipulators. I don't think they put you on Parrish Island because you're weak. Probably they put you on Parrish Island because you were too strong, because you'd started to see through something you weren't meant to see through. You're starting to sound as crazy as me, he smiled. Can I ask you a personal question, she said, almost shyly. Bring it on, he said. What's your name? For the first time that day he laughed, a loud, explosive laugh from his belly, from his soul. He extended a hand mock formally. Pleased to meet you, Laurel Holland, he said. My name is Harrison Ambler, but you can call me Hal. I like that better than patient number 5312, she said. She placed both her hands in his short brown hair, and then once more brushed them lightly over his face. She turned his head in one direction and another, as if playing with a mannequin. Then she leaned forward and caressed his cheek. It took him a few moments to respond at all. When he did, it was the way a desert traveler who had been dying of thirst arrives at an oasis. With both arms he clasped her to him, and she was firm, and she was soft, and she was all he had in the world, and she was enough. When they broke off, there were tears in both their eyes. I believe you, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. I believe you're you. You may be the only one, he said quietly. What about your friends? I told you. For the past 20 years, I've been pretty much an insolato, professional protocol. My friends are my colleagues, and there's no way to track them down. At the moment, they could be at any latitude and longitude you name, depending on the assignment. None of us operatives knew one another's real names anyway. That was a basic rule. Forget that. What about your friends from childhood, college? Shivering with the sudden recollection, he told her about his call to Dylan Sutcliffe. She was stopped by that, but only for a few seconds. Maybe he's got early Alzheimer's. Maybe he was in a car crash, scrambled his brains. Maybe he always hated you. Or maybe he thought you were trying to borrow money. Who knows? She stood up, fetched a pencil and a piece of paper, and placed them in front of him. Write down the names of people you can remember and who'd remember you. A kid from the neighborhood when you were growing up, a roommate at college, whatever. Go for the less common names so we don't get too many false hits. I'd have no idea of how to reach these people now. Right, she charged with a brush-off gesture. Ambler wrote a dozen random names from his Camden neighborhood, from high school, from summer camp, from Carlisle. She took the sheet from him, and together they walked to a small nook off the kitchen, where she had a slightly battered-looking computer. It looked as if it had been purchased from an army surplus store. It's a dial-up connection, she apologized, but it's amazing what you can find out online. Listen, he said cautiously, I'm not sure you really want to do this. He had already brought her more deeply into his own nightmare than he had meant to. He dreaded entangling her further. It's my house, I'll do what I want. As he watched over her shoulder, she seated herself before the computer and typed the names into a people finder search engine. 5 minutes later, she got half a dozen phone numbers from the dozen names, and she transcribed the phone numbers in neat handwriting. Then she handed him the handset of a nearby telephone. Reach out and touch someone, she told him. There was certainty in her eyes. No, he said, not from your phone. Worries about the long-distance charges? That's sweet. You can leave a quarter in my bureau, like Sidney Poitier in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? It isn't that. Ambler paused. He didn't want to sound paranoid, but he knew that precautions that were second nature to an operative could seem strange to a civilian. It's just that I don't know for sure whether my phone's tapped. She seemed unfazed by the prospect. Isn't there a way to check? Not really. She shook her head. What a world you live in. He watched as she idly typed his name into her search engine. The result now had the aura of inevitability. Your search, Harrison Ambler, did not match any documents. I'll use a cell phone, Ambler said, taking out the Nokia. Safer that way. He took a deep breath and called the first number on the list. Is there an Elaine Lassiter there? He asked, keeping his voice even. My wife passed away last year, a whispery voice replied. I'm sorry to hear that, Ambler said hastily. The phone at the second number for Gregson Burns was picked up immediately. I'm looking for a Gregson Burns, Ambler began. Speaking, the voice cut in. Greg, it's Hal Ambler. It's been a long time, I know. If this is a courtesy call, please put me on the do not call list. The voice, a tenor reedy with annoyance, instructed. Did you grow up on Hawthorne Street in Camden? Ambler persisted. Warily, yes. Ambler made out a woman's querulous voice in the background. Who's that calling? And you don't remember Hal Ambler from across the street? Or anybody named Ambler? Eric Ambler, the writer I've heard of. He's dead. Feel free to join him because you're wasting my time. The man clicked off. The floor seemed to sway beneath Ambler's feet. Swiftly he called the next number on the list, Julianne Deitches Murchison, as she was now listed, still resident in Delaware. Yet there was not a flicker of recognition when the woman by that name finally came to the phone. Unlike Gregson Burns, she was cordial and hurried and unsuspicious, seemingly baffled by her caller's confusion. Now, you didn't say your name was Sandler, did you? She asked, trying to be helpful. Because I definitely knew a boy named Sandler. By the time Ambler was halfway through the list of numbers, he was having a hard time getting his eyes to focus. Cold sweat had broken out on his face. Now he stared at the sheet for a long time and crumpled it into a ball, crushing it in his fist. Presently he sank to his knees and closed his eyes. When he opened them, he saw Laurel Holland standing over him, her face drawn. Don't you see? It's no use. The words came from Ambler like a groan from deep within him. I can't do this anymore. Screw it, she said. Everybody's in on it. Or I don't know what. It doesn't matter. We don't need to deal with this right now. I shouldn't have pushed you. No, his voice was husky, but I'm sorry, I just can't. And you're not going to, not anymore. Don't apologize. You're not going to give them the satisfaction. Them. That empty, unpalatable word again. Yes, them. Whoever's responsible for the whole goddamn charade. You're not going to give them the satisfaction. Maybe they're trying to drive you around the bend. Well, screw it. We're not playing their game. Deal? Ambler shakily rose to his feet. Deal, he said, his voice thick with emotions he could no longer control. She took him into her arms, and he seemed to grow stronger in her embrace. Look, maybe we're all an idea in the mind of God. I once had a boyfriend who used to say that our best chance of immortality was the realization that we do not exist. Granted, he was stoned at the time. She pressed her forehead to his, and he could feel her smile. I'm just saying we have to choose what to believe sometimes, and, hell, I choose you. Instincts, right? But Laurel, shut up, okay? I believe you, Harrison Ambler. I believe you. Ambler felt as if the sun, warming and radiant, had suddenly appeared in a midnight sky.